Good evening. Thanks for coming. I'm very pleased to have Sam come tonight. I've known him for quite a few years with my work on the waterfront, and he's been a great addition to the Kalmar Nyckel, where he is a senior historian and director of education for the Kalmar Nyckel Foundation. I think all of you know the Kalmar Nyckel and the Kalmar Nyckel Foundation. It's a fellowship of Delaware, and Sam as an educator, his scholarship, his programs, and partnerships with leading museums, like the Smithsonian in DC, the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, have helped transform the Kalmar Nyckel into one of Delaware's great educational resources. It has a new maritime center, a revitalized shipyard campus in Wilmington, award-winning exhibits, classroom programs. Kalmar Nyckel Foundation reaches 40,000 students a year and visitors a year. And I don't know how many of you have ever gone on the Kalmar Nyckel for, if you haven't, you should sign up, pay your money, and go on the Kalmar Nyckel because it's a great experience. I know the captain too, and she's also true. I know both captains, and they're birders. They're terrific. So this year, Sam is teaming up with Professor Timothy Walker, who is the author of Sailing to Freedom, and is considered the leading historian of maritime underground railroad, to advance new research. And together, they're going to present new findings at the 12th Maritime Heritage Conference in Buffalo, September 24th to 27th. So we have a national expert with us. But Sam also is a former trial lawyer and a former Teacher of the Year at the national level, and he's currently the president of the Council of American Maritime Museums. Welcome.
Thank you, Sally. That was nice. And I'll say a little bit about, I am so delighted to be able to advance this research further, and have made a new friend who happens to be the top scholar in the Maritime Underground Railroad. So we're kindred spirits and are going to be able to push the envelope a little more. Well, I'm so delighted to be here. I'd not been here before, but it's such a nice facility and this club, and to get this many people out on a Tuesday evening when it's freezing, I'm like so impressed. And we had the Zoom call, so it really delighted to be here. I should have brought some great slides of the ship. I had forgotten that, maybe not everybody has been on the ship or seen the ship, but certainly come down and visit us. Maybe we schedule a guided tour of the facility, and we could get you like maybe a deck tour or something at some appropriate moment. If you have grandkids, I'm judging by the age, maybe I shouldn't be an ageist. That make me not DEI. If you have children, grandchildren of all ages, friends who love Legos, and frankly, you can be any age and love Legos. We run a great Lego shipbuilding program. It's always the first Saturday of March. So this time it's less than 2 weeks away. So it's March 1st. Come down and see us if you like Legos or you know anybody who does. It's an amazing day. It's probably our best day in the community. Well, Scholars Program, I was like, whoa, I better be good today. So I put some new slides together for you. And here I have the map. We created a new map, worked with Nat Geo a little bit and the National Park Service to create a new map. I wasn't happy with the standard maps of the Underground Railroad, where they tried to show the volume as well as sort of many of the directions which the freedom seekers would go. So this is a new map. Now you can see it's already dated because I don't have Gulf of America down there. I still have Gulf of Mexico, but we will, I'm not in the White House, so I won't get kicked out. Anyway, I love the work we did on this map because it shows you the three main lines. And there's a maritime line, which nobody knows much about, and I'll be talking about the maritime aspects. And then there's the eastern line that runs right through Wilmington. Virtually all of the eastern line runs right through Wilmington, and there are good reasons for that. And then there is a central line that sort of bows up a little bit with the Mississippi, but mostly the Ohio, and crosses the Ohio from Kentucky and a little bit of what was then Virginia before West Virginia became a state during the Civil War, crossing over the Ohio River into mostly Ohio, but sometimes Indiana and Illinois. And then there was a little sliver going all the way up the Mississippi. And then there are offshoots going south, going to Texas, going to Florida, and as far as the Bahamas as well. So this is a nice sense to give you sort of the overview. The other thing is there aren't, we should probably get this out of the way. There aren't real hard figures on the Underground Railroad. They didn't keep good records. I'll talk about the records for obvious reasons. This was secret. We wanted to keep it secret. Not many of the fugitives were literate themselves. Many, some were, some weren't, but so there's some of that. The people involved mostly didn't want to keep records for good reasons. So it's a little hard to piece it together. We don't really have, what we would call numbers that we could stand firm on. So I use about 100,000. You see as many as 150,000. And this is the totality from 1790, from the beginning of, this isn't the colonial period. This would be from the adoption of the Constitution through really the beginning of the Civil War. Sometimes you get taken up to 61. Now, technically, the Underground Railroad continues in some ways as the Union armies would get close to various locales. Obviously, the closer the front lines were, the more you were inclined to run away and get across the line. So there's a piece that includes the Civil War. This would be not including any who self-liberated during the war. And then about 30,000 are ultimately going to go to Canada. Some would go to Canada and come back. Some go all the way to England. Frederick Douglass, Henry Box Brown. Many of them go to Scotland or England, just because you're not really safe unless you get all the way out of the U.S. until after the Civil War. I should say, this would be a good time to mention, Frederick Douglass had a great line that I always love. Douglass is one of the giants of the Underground Railroad and abolitionism. And he has a story that connects to Wilmington. He mentioned that as a form of emancipation, the Underground Railroad is like using a teaspoon to bail the ocean. So with 4 million slaves by 1860, this isn't really an effective mechanism to liberate slaves and to abolish slavery. This isn't going to get it done. You're going to have to do it constitutionally. You're going to have to do it militarily, economically, but it isn't a satisfying way in which you're going to eradicate slavery. However, I should also mention that, and one of the reasons I like it so much is that it had an outsized political effect all beyond its numbers, way beyond the 100,000. Frederick Douglass, his career alone would probably let you know that. What it did is polarize, and we're in sort of I won't analogize today, but you might. It was a very polarizing series of events, that every liberated slave, every fugitive who made it became a problem for Northerners in a way that they didn't have a problem before. Now they have a problem and they have to recognize it and think about it. And what do we do about it? And are we supporting emancipation and abolitionism? Are we not? Are we supporting the Underground Railroad? What are we doing about it? And that, of course, evolves and changes all the way through from 1790 to the Civil War. And of course, it absolutely drives Southerners bonkers. So it is very polarizing. It makes every Southerner think that every Northerner is a wild-eyed John Brown abolitionist. And that just wasn't true. Most weren't. And most didn't care. And most thought it wasn't their problem. I don't own slaves, so it's not my problem kind of thing. And increasingly, it was something that Northerners had to deal with, and what were they going to do about it? And then, of course, Southerners, it was very much a problem, and it bothered them beyond all, beyond the sense that just the numbers would certainly entail. So it becomes a political issue, a defining political issue. It ends up getting galvanized by the Western expansion. And so the Civil War, North and South, is really fought over the West. But this interesting aspect of it, the Underground Railroad, really helps bring on that polarization and leads to the Civil War. So it's a big story. The other nice thing I did mention a couple of times at our events, it dawned on me one time that I think, and we teach this in the classroom a lot, so I created this classroom lesson called 5 Ways to Freedom. And it dawns on me that I think more Americans, school children, adults, know this story better than any other American history story. And I don't know what that says about us. I think it's a good thing. But it is interesting. If I ask people about the Civil War, the Revolution, or the New Deal, or the Depression, or William McKinley, or whatever comes up, tariffs, um, Andrew Jackson, they don't know much, really. They would be barely able to place it in the correct half century if they've even heard of it. Americans are pretty culturally illiterate. I hate to say. Now, you guys are the exception. That's why you're in the Scholars Guild. That's why you're out on a Tuesday night listening to me. But it says something nice and something that's very striking, that of all the stories in American history, and I would say that the average person on the street not only knows and could identify the Underground Railroad, could describe it, and would get it pretty accurate. Not every part of it, but get it pretty accurate. Okay. I mentioned we did this, we developed this program to go out into classrooms, and the derivation of our name, Five Ways to Freedom, was it struck us that there were 5 basic modes by which people, operated on the Underground Railroad and fled slavery. And that we were going to look at ships and boats and put the maritime piece, which is often missing because we're the Kalmar Nyckel and we're a maritime educational organization in Delaware, we would help put that on the map and get you to see it within the context. And so we thought it would be very helpful for kids to really understand. And what I liked about it was the agency that it puts kids on the ground and deciding how are you going to do it. So you've decided to do it, but where are you going? When are you going? How are you going? How are you going to do it? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? So that's sort of where I came up with the 5 ways. The other thing, turns out that Wilmington had 5 roads, 5 ways into Wilmington, and 5 main ways out of Wilmington. And that was a nice sort of happy coincidence that worked with my theme. And then there are 5 great heroes, which we'll look at, all of which have a major role in Wilmington. And I better not leave that mic too far. You can see the railroad is the easy one. That railroad line went in 1837. It's the Amtrak line today. Frederick Douglass was one of the first passengers. He fled Baltimore with his fiance's brother's free sailor outfit, and faked. He had some documents from his fiance's brother, and took the train from Baltimore to Wilmington and got off at the Wilmington train station. Why it's not called the Frederick Douglass train station is beyond me, but anyway, we won't get into that. But I do get chills when I think of Frederick Douglass escaping by train on that train. He's one of the first passengers, September 2nd of 1838. The place had only been open a year. It doesn't even connect all the way to Philadelphia. This is the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore line. Becomes the main north-south line. It becomes right through Wilmington, and it becomes what is today's Amtrak line. He gets off in Wilmington and takes a steamboat up to Philadelphia, goes right past our property, our campus, and overlook of our maritime campus. So I do get a thrill out of thinking about him escaping that way. This brings up the waterway. So obviously the Delaware Bay becomes the Delaware River, and will take you up to free states of Philadelphia, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and beyond. And there's this navigable riverway called the Christina right into Wilmington, in and out of Wilmington. So that's a major thoroughfare. And obviously we'll play that up with the maritime aspects. There are 3 major roads, and these are in green. One is sort of the Newport Road, and I guess it's mostly 95 today or similar. 2 roads coming up from Old Newcastle, 13 and 9. What becomes 52 is going to go out to Longwood and go out to the Longwood Progressive Meeting and out to Chester County that way. And that was often a safer way to go than going directly to Philadelphia. You might want to go west before you go east. And then a direct route up to Westchester, where I grew up, and what is it, Route 100, and the Westchester Pike. I guess it's still called the Westchester Pike. It was like a 2-lane road when I was a boy. And obviously there's a major Quaker community out in Longwood. There's major Quaker influence in Westchester and Chester County. So that's a reason why you'd be going that way, or you'd take a more direct route, what's sometimes called the Darby Road, which kind of must come through here close, or 95 and goes straight to a straighter line up to Philadelphia. Yeah, I just mentioned all this. This just is the same map with a little better perspective. So you can see where the 100 is, the Delaware 100, you can see where the line is and why you might be going those routes. And so it's nice to have a sense of geography. It helps to explain, it's the infrastructure and the location of Wilmington that makes it so central to the Underground Railroad, and a lot of other things. Okay, I mentioned the 5 heroes. Frederick Douglass is my great hero, and he does take the train, gets off at Wilmington, takes a steamboat up to Philadelphia. He takes another ferry over to Camden, takes a train across New Jersey to the Hudson Ferry, takes a ferry. So think how many boats, when I get to the maritime, think how many boats he's taken to get to New York, get to Manhattan. And then ultimately he's going to meet up there with David Ruggles. His fiancee is going to come up. She's free. She's a free woman in Baltimore. She's going to come up. They're going to get married soon. And they're off to New Bedford. And he kicks around New Bedford for a couple of years doing odd jobs. He was a caulker of ships, but they wouldn't let him caulk up in New England. You know, it was sort of a Gild labor union, early proto labor union kind of thing. But he did a lot of odd jobs and then was found by William Lloyd Garrison and became the top speaker on the circuit. Probably gave, this is the kind of evidence that's hard to prove, but I think he probably gave more talks, reached more live people because there were no microphones in those days than any other American in history. That would be hard to prove, but he talked so many times in so many areas all over the North and Northwest. Came to Longwood. He was at the Longwood Preservation Society, the Friends there. And, you know, at great risk, because even in the North, he was not necessarily a welcome speaker. This is not a topic that we want to talk about or hear about in many places. Harriet, of course, is known as the great giant of the Underground Railroad. All 13 of her documented expeditions, her own, and then the 12 others where she's rescuing other slaves, family, and others. She walks through Wilmington. Now, a couple of times she'll take a horse and carriage, but mostly she's walking. And, you know, she works with Thomas Garrett quite extensively, and then with William Still. So Garrett, I think most of you know, he's the giant Quaker abolitionist Underground Railroad conductor of Wilmington, the Tubman Garrett Park. William Still may not be as well known. He is the giant of Philadelphia. He's the free black who runs the Vigilance Society, the Anti-Slave Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia. He starts out as the janitor. He was born in New Jersey as a free man and sort of works his way up in Philadelphia and has an incredible business career as well. And he's a giant, and we'll talk about why, as a conductor and a recorder of Underground Railroad. And the guy you don't recognize is Captain Fountain. So Fountain is the one of 3 or 4 that we have pretty good evidence of. And so he's the most prominent. So I had there's no photograph of him, so I had a portrait drawn of Captain Fountain, of what he might have looked like. We have some contemporaneous, sketches, but they're not like portraits. They're sort of action sketches, and they don't really do them justice. So he's the maritime captain that represents the whole maritime piece to the Underground Railroad. I better push on. This is where the Kalmar Nyckel story connects to the Underground Railroad story in Delaware and Wilmington. So it turns out that the famous rocks in Delaware, the Blue Rocks in Fort Christina Park, which was the landing site of the Kalmar Nyckel, the original Kalmar Nyckel in 1638. They pulled up, they landed, they moored the ship, they built Fort Christina, they launched the colony of New Sweden, which is why we built this replica ship. down there right next to the rocks. Those same rock formations, it turns out, in the 1840s and 50s were used by abolitionist sea captains to pull up to the same thing, use as a wharf. They were still out of town. The industry hadn't quite come to the rocks yet, although they would soon. And it's out of town and it's kind of a, dark, not very obvious location. And so we have a number of records that will demonstrate that Fountain and others, probably three others, were using the rocks quite often to drop off. Sometimes it's 2 and 3, sometimes it's as many as 20, 25 fugitive slaves running away on the Underground Railroad. Here I've pictured, we have a great letter from Thomas Garrett written to William Still, which tells you about the network, or they're writing letters all the time, corresponding about different people they know are on the Underground Railroad and how we help them get from point A to point B. How do we help them get from Wilmington or parts in the South coming to Wilmington? And then how do we get them to Philadelphia? So I had this drawing made by Hal Taylor, a great local artist from New Jersey. I was going to do, I'll give you a peek. So I needed an artist rendering of the rocks to do this exhibit panel, which is out on our balcony. And it captures Craig bringing a horse and carriage, knowing that Fountain's coming to the rocks. He's going to help these fugitive freedom seekers. And he and Garrett together are going to help navigate them up to Philadelphia and to William Still's Vigilance Committee and get them to freedom. So it's a nice homage to the rocks and the way it would have looked in that period. In the lower right corner is a photo of from the public archives, from the Delaware Public Archives, of a schooner, much like the kind that Captain Fountain would have used, tied up at the rocks in the 1890s. So 30, 40 years later, they were still using it to tie up at the rocks. It's becoming industrialized by then, and then it becomes a full-on industrial site, Jackson and Sharp. It's a major shipyard and a major railcar manufacturing. But those are nice scenes of the rocks at low tide. They're still there. Fort Christina is built around it. And so when people come, they think of the Kalmar Nyckel, but I'm trying to get them to think of Fountain and the Underground, Henry Craig and the Underground Railroad. So this is just by panel, which you can come and see. This is the main point, I guess, of the talk, is how important the maritime aspects of the Underground Railroad were. I wasn't quite sure when I started doing the research, and the more research I did, the more it became compelling that this is not only an important story for the Kalmar Nyckel and for Wilmington and Delaware, but this is a nationally significant story. That it turns out at least, and I'm being very conservative here, at least 30% of all those who escaped successfully by sea. Now that would include ocean, that would include Chesapeake Bay, and it would include Delaware Bay. So that's what we mean by sea. There are a lot of others who would have escaped using watercraft and having to cross rivers. And so we're not quite sure, but probably 50, maybe 75% used. And it depends what you would mean by how important the watercraft was to the escape. So you might walk 90% of the way, but you've got to cross the Ohio River to get to Ohio or Indiana and free territory. And there are no bridges across until 1866. So you're going to have to take a watercraft of some kind. You either get on it as a passenger, are gifted one, you abscond with one, but watercraft of all kind are used in this Underground Railroad. So that's a nifty story that not enough people know how important the maritime aspects. There's good reason for it. If you're deep in the heart of the South, walking a long, long way, and maybe I should go all the way back. I hate to do this to you, but if you go all the way back, if you're down in Norfolk, Virginia, or you're down in North Carolina, or you're in the deep part of the South, you're going to go by river, or you're going to go by an ocean-going vessel if you're lucky to get it. Your chances of walking and the likelihood that you would pick walking or even by horse. There are a couple extraordinary train expeditions where people are hiding and what are they doing? Camouflaging themselves as free people and making it by train. But those are pretty extraordinary stories. So it is the distance that helps explain it. The other thing that helps explain it is that the both free blacks and enslaved blacks were intimately involved in all the watermen, the longshoremen, and the dock workers. And whether it was fishing or sailing, they were heavily involved as crew, some as even captains of them. So I'll move forward back to this. And so if you understand how connected free blacks and enslaved blacks were to the maritime communities on the coast, it helps to explain why they might have the opportunity to abscond or stow away or purchase like a ticket on a ocean-going vessel. So that's kind of interesting. So, and it's very high. There's so few bridges, and this is one of the areas of research that we mentioned with this Timothy Walker and I are doing, is really looking at the bridges, and they've studied bridges, so we can borrow research that's already been done, not by people that are interested in the Underground Railroad, but by people that are interested in bridges and engineering. When did the bridges first come? And the one that first grabbed my attention was the Roebling Bridge across the Ohio in Cincinnati. That's the first bridge to cross the Ohio, and that's 1866. So no fugitive freedom seeker crossed the Ohio. Occasionally it would ice up, and occasionally you see a drought, and maybe you could, walk across the ice floes. But how realistic that was, almost all of them are coming by watercraft. The other thing that's interesting is that two of the three great resources, and they're a multitude of resources, but the best resources, two of the three, come from William Still and Thomas Garrett, and come right in our Wilmington, Philadelphia, Delaware Valley network. And that's not true of just the Eastern Line, it's true of the whole historiography of the Underground Railroad. And the reason is that Garrett was not bashful about being, an abolitionist and being in favor of the Underground Railroad, as you know that story, and was, proud of it, and was overt and, pretty plain about being an activist. And he wrote a lot of open letters, and so it's those letters, and he corresponded regularly with William Still, and Still writes letters back. So we have that communication for the Underground Railroad, and those letters are a great source. He kept pretty good records. Now there's a whole dispute. He says he helped 2,800 freedom seekers. There's some dispute as to whether it was 2,400 to 2,800, but you get the idea. The other great resource is, not only did Still write letters and correspond not only with Garrett, but he's corresponding with people all over as part of the Underground Network. But his great story is that he ended up interviewing from 1853, so it wasn't his whole career, but the last 7 years of his career as the leader of the Vigilance Committee of the Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. He would sit them down, he would sit the fugitives down and interview them and record the interviews in his journal. And he asked them consistent questions. And so those journals, which he then published during at the end of Reconstruction in 1872, he's starting to worry that America's passing, civil rights is going by the board, and this story of the Underground Railroad is going to get forgotten. And so by then he's liberated enough as a free black man in the North. He feels that he can publish the stories. Nobody's going to be harmed by these stories. It's not an active network anymore. And so he compiles his journals, rewrites, sifts some of it, hires a number of sketch artists to do a number of sketches. And so his journals, which become this book, are probably the best primary source, other than the third one, which is there are 103 extant and friends of of Tim Walker have done a deep dive on doing a database on these fugitive slave narratives. And it turns out that something like 70% of those all mention escaping by sea. And that's pretty extraordinary. What we don't know is how representative of are those 103 of, let's say, the 100,000 that make it. So it's hard to extrapolate that kind of evidence, but it certainly is indicative. And then I jumped over that William Still, if you compile his records, something close to, it's just under 44% of his that he documented meticulously by interviewing them, who came through his office on their way to freedom as he would help them. Almost 44%, 43.9 or something, came by sea. So those are two pretty good sources for us. Just in case you were interested, this is probably the best letter that I like to use for school, for students. This is the letter that we base the drawing on. And so in it, he mentions cars, which are train cars. He mentions steamboats. He mentions getting across the line and how it's up to him and Craig and some others who are part of his agency, his network, how they're going to help shepherd these people across the state line into free Pennsylvania. And he mentions the Rocks. He mentions Old Swedes. He mentions that it's out of town. He had people waiting at the normal berthing in Wilmington, in the center of town near South Market Street. So he had people waiting, and Fountain never shows up because he stops off at the Rocks and he figures it's safer to unload them at the Rocks. So here you get direct evidence, not going to get a better primary source, where Garrett is writing to Still, talking about these fugitives. He doesn't mention Craig by name, but we've been able to, by inference, we know that Craig was the man that worked for John Hillis, who was a brickmaker on the east side of town. So we know it was Craig in this episode. Now, Garrett used others like Severin Johnson and some other free black agents who would help him. But this is a pretty cool story, and that he is aware that the train isn't always the best way to get them. That those are watched pretty carefully, and if someone is stopped, you're likely to get fined pretty heavily. Steamboats are also an option, it's mentioned, and we're going to have to help you walk, or we're going to have to help you with a horse or horse and carriage to get you to Pennsylvania, probably put you on the train once you're over the state line and get you to Philadelphia. Pretty interesting story. I blew it up in case we needed to see it. Still, I've already talked about, but here's the evidence. This guy, William Cashatus, is a friend. He was the former curator at the Chester County Historical Society. He's a prominent speaker and author in the Delaware Valley. He has a love of the Underground Railroad and promised some people that he would ultimately write the definitive biography of William Still, which had not been done. It had been started by a couple of black historians, but not able to finish. So he finished the project for them. And he has basically, he turned Still's journals and sifted it down into a database in which you can really see it and study it because it's there. And it really helps with this kind of evidence, where this is where the almost 44% come from. These are the means by which the 350 that he sat down and interviewed. Now he rescued and helped more than 900, but he just hadn't started to interview them. He didn't really start interviewing until about 1853. But that's why these sources are so important. And how many walked, how many took a horse and carriage, how many took the railroad. Henry Box Brown is indeed the guy who went by box, but remember that box is on a train. So he's going by train as well as by box. He mails himself to William Still's office and pops out of the box in William Still's office, and had written a letter, had a friend write a letter to say, you know, I'm coming by freight. And it's just a great story. The other interesting story, both for anyone who takes the train, they're also using a watercraft because there's no train bridge over the Susquehanna in this period. And so there's a ferry, there's a train ferry, and there's no railroad bridge down there until after the Civil War. Now there is a rickety road bridge that doesn't last the whole time, but it was built in the early 1830s, and it gets wiped out a couple different times by storms and high floods. So it was possible to cross, but infrequently by foot. But all the train traffic and most of the fugitives did not take the bridge because that was, an obvious choke point that would be well watched. So anyway, this gives you a sense of where this evidence that we build up from these various stories about why how we know the maritime aspects are so important. The other thing I should leave you with is, there are five main factors why Wilmington was so important and Delaware more largely. And, it's the propinquity, it's the proximity between, Wilmington and the state line. It's that infrastructure, the transportation network, and the various means by which one could go. Obviously, Quaker activists, and there's no larger figure than Thomas Garrett, are very important. Philadelphia, Chester County, and Newcastle and County and Wilmington. Garrett, of course, represents that. I'm not a Quaker historian. Maybe they're Quakers, and it has been interesting to me to see that I think most people assume that all Quakers were Underground Railroad activists, and that just wasn't true. In fact, it was probably a small minority. I'm not sure, 20%, 30%, but Garrett took a lot of grief from even Quakers who were not interested in breaking the law. And this is where it becomes a very modern story. It's one thing to manumit your own slaves, to argue abstractly for the abolition of slavery and freedom. It's another thing to actively break the law and actively help a fugitive at putting yourself in peril and risk fine, jail, imprisonment, that kind of thing, and ostracism, right? And so it turns out that it was a small minority of Quakers, and that's kind of interesting. And it's the reason that Garrett had a major hand in developing this Longwood Progressive Friends, still there, and why that was a major network of going west to Chester County and this progressive meeting house where you could be hidden away and eventually go into, central and northern Chester County. And you might just keep going north to New York, or you might head east to Philadelphia. Free Black communities are really important as well. And that's something that we've tried to do. That you can't understand this unless you know how important the free Black community in Wilmington generally was, and that there were over 2,000 of them in the 1850 census, and that helps to explain why there were Black activists who could help Garrett and others function on the Underground Railroad, and how one might be able to escape, how one might be able to fit in, and that you don't necessarily stand out like a shining symbol wherever you are. That there were many more free Blacks, a larger community, vibrant community with churches, self-help societies, probably, scholar clubs and theater clubs and all the kinds of things that we think of. And then the other important piece is these national anti-slavery societies that aren't Quaker. They're some Quaker, but they're largely evangelical Christians who begin to take this seriously and make it the cause. Many of them came from other reform movements, the temperance movement, many of them all then go off into feminism or proto-feminism. Many of the women who were activists, you all know this, I'm sure, who began to understand that they were being treated as second-class citizens, as activists for Black civil rights, and that they weren't given leadership positions and were being shunted aside. And it starts to help them think, well, wait a second, I'm working for Black abolitionism and civil rights. How about women? So all that is an interesting mix in this period. And it really, this begins in the mid 1830s. And from the 1830s on, this is when the Underground Railroad really takes off and becomes a network. Before that, it was a line segment, maybe. I know Sally. I know Sally thinks like I do. So I can send a fugitive to Sally's place. Maybe she lives in Chester County and help this person go from point A to point B. It doesn't become a network until there's many more people that are connected with some kind of consistency and destination. All right. Free Black community. I just thought I would put the numbers. It's a little larger than you would think. And pretty interesting. So Wilmington has about a little less than 14,000 and 2,100 of which are Black. So it surprised me, larger than you would think. It dips a little from a percentage standpoint, but still there by 1860. So that makes that point. I don't know if you're interested. I thought I have all this census information. Delaware, of course, is still a Black slave, is still a slave state. It's a border state. It's got a very low percentage, as you'll see, and it's dipping quite significantly. And it's 1.6% by 1860. But it's still a slave state. It's a border state. It doesn't join the Confederacy, as you know. But that's interesting. How important the free Black community was in Delaware generally. I think I have some comparison. You'll see that, almost 20,000 free Blacks in Philadelphia in 1850. That's a lot of people who are involved and might be involved. Not all of them are going to be involved in the Underground Railroad, but you could see how this might begin to work. And then 22,000, of course, Pennsylvania has abolished slavery by the time of the Revolution. Baltimore, even more important, we know a lot from Frederick Douglass and how vibrant the Black community, both a mix of, he was enslaved, a mix of enslaved and free Blacks in Baltimore, which was the other major hub out of which many of these are going to get the idea that they might join the Underground Railroad. So this is my last thing before I'll take some questions. Yeah, there's a picture of Tim. I happened to run into him fortuitously down at the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Center in Maryland. And if you haven't been, I highly recommend it. There's a nature preserve there, Blackwater. Wildlife. Yeah, wildlife. Magnificent. And you get such a sense of the landscape when you're down there. You feel it. Anyway, it's a wonderful little center, sort of museum. They don't call it a museum, but a center. And there's a great auto tour. So basically, you can either read, you can get an app on your phone, you can get the map and read it to yourself and take the various stops that are associated with the Harriet Tubman tour. I highly recommend it. I've done it a couple of times. So we're interested in pushing the envelope. You have to be creative with your evidence and look for new ways to approach a topic to help our understanding. And so I'm excited to be partnering with him, and we're going to do I don't know, they call it a showcase at this 12th. Why Buffalo? Well, Buffalo, this is the 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal. So they're having a big celebration of canal boats and canal societies, and we're sort of glomming onto that anniversary. So that's why we're going to be in Buffalo. With that, I'll take questions. So thank you. I forgot I have to, and I need to repeat the questions. Anybody have a question? Yes, yeah, whatever. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So I was curious, is there information about, you talked about 40+% in some cases going by water. Does that change decade to decade through this period? Does it increase over time as networks build or?
Don't know enough to answer it definitively. It clearly changes, but how much and why, that's a really interesting, because nothing is static. And that's really interesting. There are a couple things I do know that hit on this. It doesn't answer your question, but are allied. One of the reasons these abolitionist sea captains were coming to Wilmington instead of Philadelphia, sometimes they went, you're on the Delaware. Why are you stopping in Wilmington when you could go directly to Philadelphia? And many of them did, and they would drop fugitives off at League Island, which is FDR Park today, near where the all the sports stadiums are down there, and the Navy Yard. It was an island then. One of the interesting facts that came across more and more, why were they doing it? Well, partly it was Garrett's network, and he's got a defined network. And so you want to pass people off but still has a defined network in Philadelphia. Turns out that by the 1850s, anyone leaving a port in the South was under heightened scrutiny because they knew so many runaways were absconding on ships. So this was well known to Southerners. And so port managers and sheriffs, marshals in the seaport towns or fishing villages were increasingly scrutinizing, and you had to get paperwork and documentation to leave, and you had to be inspected. You had to have your ship inspected. And I think it differs by state. So I haven't done enough research to sort of show which state. Most of them are coming out of Virginia, and Norfolk is the main network because Norfolk's a big funnel. And it's a prominent port. So runaways are coming to Norfolk and getting on ships that they know are safe, or crewmen or somebody are stowing them away. So we do know that's a change that happens where more and more ship captains are heading for Wilmington because you're not as highly scrutinized if you're going from a southern slave seaport to another southern slave seaport, and Wilmington is a slave state. Delaware is a slave state, and it's seen as a slavery port and not as alarming as Philadelphia or New Bedford or New York scream runaway slave freedom seeker, right? That's interesting. And that's one of the reasons they began to come to Philadelphia. The other thing, increasingly, we found some notes and evidence that Captain Fountain would sometimes take people from the Rocks in Wilmington and take them up to Philadelphia. So, that was in the 1850s, but it's a very complicated, fluid sort of story, and you've really hit on that. And that's research we need to do. I mean, it's there. We just have to really pay attention to the chronology and the changes over time. Very, very good. I like it.
Any other questions? Yeah, Nancy.
I have a comment. I used to live on a farm near Newark, Delaware. It's called Penn Manor Farm. And it had it originally had slave quarters that were in disuse right after, because there were obviously Quaker activists that lived there, because underneath my part of the farm was a hidden compartment cellar that with 2 rows of seats for hiding slaves. And it was I mean, I used to be visited regularly by people to take pictures and look at it. It was it was right next to the Quaker Meeting House in Newark.
That's a good point, which I didn't emphasize, but Harriet Tubman's walking expeditions emphasize how important it was to have some usually Quaker, who were supportive and would hide you and feed you and help you on your way. And so that helped, put Delaware on the map of the Eastern Line. Others?
And just to expand a little bit, so there must have been an anti-underground railroad, a sort of industry of slave catchers. And I know only a very little bit about it from, I think what's called the Battle of Christiana, which was, so if you'd like to expound, is this a totally separate topic of research, or is it just other side of the coin? I mean, it must have famous figures and.
Very interesting question, and I like it very much. I'm not an authority on it, but you can't do the Underground Railroad without understanding that there are people that are trying to stop you or prevent you or catch you. And even blacks are part, you know, they might sell you down the river, anybody for money or for, you know, prestige or advantage. Um, and that's a very human thing. But yeah, obviously very active. Every one of these slave owners is still looking to get their property back that's valuable. And many of them are very unhappy about it. And so it's an enormous part of the story. And it's one of the reasons the watercraft are so important, because of the very few bridges. And in Wilmington, there's the Market Street Bridge. That's the first bridge to go across the Christina if you're going to come that way. It's one little choke point, and we have some stories of Harriet having to be hidden in carriages and a couple of times because it was being watched closely. And so that's an important, it is the flip side of the coin. I really like the way you put it, but you can't understand either side of the coin. You can't understand why there would be slave catchers and how many of them there would be, and the whole Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that begins to, you know, propagate that in the North, that you were given advantages, monetary advantages for hunting people down. Courts, judges, magistrates would be given that basically they were paid twice as much if they found that the subject was a slave, and half as much if they found for the subject being free. So there's an incentive for the magistrate, not that the magistrate would do it that way, but you know, there's an economic incentive to find people as slaves. It also becomes enormous stories in locales where there are runaway slaves who are living in Chester County, they're living in Wilmington, they're living wherever they are, all through the North. And when a slave catcher catches them, you know, and Harriet Tubman, most of them, Douglass, most of them have stories. The community has to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to help to prevent this slave catcher from being able to drag this person back south? And none of them are really free. I mean, that's why the war is so important. The Emancipation, you know, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments are so important, because you're not really free until after the Civil War, which is why many of them are going to go all the way to Canada, and they're going to go to England, as far as England. Because even though you're in the North, you're subject to capture. And not a lot of Northerners are going to step in, and, you know, we could analogize to that today. Question?
No, I just,
You're in charge.
a thought occurred to me. Were there other, we know about the Quakers' role in all this. Were there other religious organizations? And the reason I'm asking that question is we used to attend a church called Silverside Church, which is on Silverside Road, and is actually called the Second Baptist Church. There's not the American Baptist Convention. And were there other Jewish, Catholic, Baptist organizations involved in some way? Maybe not that.
I know very few Jewish. Are there other denominations besides Quakers who are involved in and that was that's really the Anti-Slavery Society. That's William Lloyd Garrison and others who are, they're not Quaker. You know, they're of different, often Presbyterian, sometimes Baptist. They could be of any denomination, really, who take up the cause and make it a cause, and push it to the front of the cause. Like, which cause are you fighting for today or this year or this decade? And so they're the ones that actively, it becomes a moral question for them. And so once it becomes a moral question, and there are issues today of morality where you could analogize. You know, it's very unpopular. Just that's the other thing. So you have to be committed. So it's very unpopular, even in the North. But I really like this flip side of the coin, and yeah, the whole study of it. And I forgot. I don't think I finished the point about why the watercraft, because you can take a watercraft and sneak across a river and not be bound by where people might be standing, sitting, observing. It's why the rocks are being used as a drop-off point instead of right in downtown Wilmington where you might be visible and seen. Very good point. It does connect.
Back here first. She's first. You're next.
Thanks. I just wanted to urge people to take a look at the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway, which you mentioned. This is an audio tour that you can download onto your phone, and it is magnificent. It's beautifully produced, and it'll really put you in the places that you're stopping. So, for instance, if you're on the Eastern Shore, where Harriet Tubman was from, and they're talking about what it would be like to escape into those swamps. On the audio tour, you're going to hear the sounds of the night. You're going to hear the crickets. You're going to hear the owls. And it's just a beautifully, beautifully produced and researched thing. So it's a great tour.
It's a great example of the advantages of the 21st century technology that's available to you. And I do highly recommend it. It's a full day trip, but if you're down on the Eastern Shore, build it into like a little, it can be a naturalist thing as well. A lot of birding down there, I'm sure. But it is wonderful. I highly recommend it. It's very evocative. To me, this is an important subject. The other interesting thing is that it's helpful to see it from that end. And that when you think about it, it's a big funnel that everybody is coming, walking, taking a horse or a carriage, maybe train. They're all coming towards Wilmington. They're all headed our way. And you get a sense of it from the other side.
And I just want to mention that Thomas Garrett's, I am Quaker. I actually am the historian for the Meeting House. And Thomas Garrett's grave is at the 4th and West Meeting House. And people regularly come to see it. And I could talk more about Thomas Garrett, but it's your show.
I just wanted to know, once people got to Wilmington, was there a reason they just didn't take a boat across to New Jersey? Because there's a large Quaker community there.
Some did, but Philadelphia was the hub of this Underground Railroad network where people knew they could get help and assistance. Problem with New Jersey, now maybe if you knew the Meeting House or you knew the family there or something, you might do it. But often there are a number of stories of people rowing or taking watercraft over to New Jersey and then getting help by oystermen and other fishermen to help them get to navigate to Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is the hub. And then from there, you might go to New Jersey, New York, up to Albany or, other Rochester and Buffalo and other places. So you're going to keep going. But lots of traffic on the Delaware, as you mentioned it. Some might well just go directly to New Jersey.
One time for just one or two more.
The movie Harriet, great movie. The most recent one with Cynthia Erivo, the character in Philadelphia, was that William Still? Okay. I didn't realize that. Thank you.
And Garrett's in it as well, right?
Well, yeah.
So, but you recognize Garrett. But yeah, Still's a really interesting guy. Self-made now.
With Delaware being a slave state, was there no official attempt to put an end to all these people running through Wilmington? It seemed like it was a hub. I know that northern Delaware is significantly different than southern Delaware, and still is.
Into that. Good and bad. My favorite colleague at the Kalmar Nyckel Foundation grew up outside Dover on a farm, and I guess his father was state police. So he's southern, lower Delaware. He says, we want to blow up the canal bridges and secede. He always threatens to secede from the rest of Delaware. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, that is interesting. It's part of this anti-slavery network. And because there were so few slave owners in Delaware and so few slaves, it's probably, I'm guessing here, but it's more likely to be an open pathway than it would be in, departed Virginia or Kentucky, where, you were highly suspect and, would not, many white assistants on the Underground Railroad are captured in the South and then put in prison or horrible things happen to them. So you wouldn't want that. So Delaware is, yeah. And, it doesn't really, it really does take the 13th and 14th amendments to really eradicate slavery in Delaware. And I think it takes them a while to actually sort of, adopt the, the amendment. But that's an interesting political story. And it's a little like the upper Chesapeake and the Eastern Shore, where free labor was becoming much more effective and was what most landowners wanted to use. That slavery is not, it can, this can be valuable property, but it's not necessarily a very efficient way to farm. That without selfish interest in the product, you might not be quite so engaged and energetic in the process. So it was losing slaves, and that's an interesting part of the Eastern Shore history.
I mean, I read somewhere that a lot of people had a couple of slaves almost as a matter of principle, but it was much more economically viable to hire people and pay them cheaply than it was to house them, clothe them, have them on your property, if they got sick there, you had to deal with it. Where if they're independent, you just pay them and they come and go. And so people who were slave owners, it was often just a couple, just to show that they were kind of loving the principle of it. So that's something that I read in Delaware.
Just add one thing, because this is integral to the Harriet Tubman story. There are also slaves who are able to hire themselves out with an arrangement with their owners. And the owners often like that, because the owner would get the money and the slave might get a percentage of that money, depending. But both Frederick Douglass, as a very skilled caulker in the shipbuilding industry, and Harriet Tubman, who was, very effective out in the woods, cutting and hauling timber, both of them made a lot of money and gained a lot of independence. And it probably helped them feel that they could actually take this journey. And so that's an interesting part, that, it is about money.
And Garrett was arrested for receiving stolen properties, and he lost his business. He lost all of his funding. And at the time of his trial, he basically stood up and said, "Hey, come to me if you need help. I lost everything. What else do I have to lose?" And I heard an interesting lecture from a former CEO or whatever of Hagley, head of the Hagley, who said he found a letter from, I think it was Samuel DuPont. And he said the original DuPonts one reason that they came to the Brandywine was because of the Quaker community and the honesty and the hardworking nature of the Quakers. So there was always, even though the DuPont company and Quakers never had much to do with each other, there was always an understanding and of sort of fraternity, I guess. So, and he found a letter that one of the DuPonts wrote to his granddaughter, talking about how, I think it was Samuel, bailed Garrett out. And that is not known in the Quaker world at all. But it's kind of interesting, because he was bankrupted in this court trial. So, and when he died, apparently many of the free blacks in Wilmington carried his casket through the town to the graveyard. So he was very revered. Yeah.
That makes sense, because now you know that there was quite a large population, over 2,000 free blacks in Wilmington, who could be there to honor and be part of the ceremony and actually carry his casket. So it does begin to make sense. Great. Well,
Anyway, thank you. Another round of applause. And he'll be hanging out as we pack up, so you can come up and talk to him. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next month.